Hello and welcome to episode 177 of Page One, the Writers' Podcast. I'm Marco.
I'm Tarek.
And thanks for joining us on the podcast, where we'd like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, find out how they got into the industry and try and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. And we've got a great back catalogue of guests, so please do go and check that out. But this week's guest actually gave a sort of sneak peek last week, in the sense that last week's episode was the live recording at Caimh Festival with RJ Barker, which was a great episode, so please do go back and listen to that one. But I did mention there were three authors in the audience, two of whom have already been guests on the podcast, Shauna Lawless and Tendai Huchu, and we make that a hat trick this week with Caimh McDonnell.
Yes, that's right. An Irishman who is a former professional stand-up comedian and a TV writer who now concentrates all of his energies on writing books. Born in Limerick, raised in Dublin, he's taken the hop across the water, and Caimh now calls Manchester his home. Now, his TV writing work has seen him work on some of the biggest topical comedy shows on British TV, things like Sarah Millican television programme Mock the Week, Have I Got News for You? He's done work as a children's TV writer, which has earned him a BAFTA nomination for the CBBC animated series Pet Squad, which he created. But these days, he can be found happily writing his next book in the office in the back garden with only his dog and his imagination for company. His book, I Have Sinned, was shortlisted for the 2019 Kindle Storyteller Award, but his previous debut novel, entitled A Man with One of Those Faces, was nominated for the Best Novel at the 2017 CAP Awards. And I'm not entirely sure what CAP stands for, but that was all read from his magnificently well-researched biography on his own website. So thank you, Caimh. If only more authors were as helpful.
Exactly, yeah. Do our work for us. And his debut novel was the start of what was called the Dublin trilogy, but there are now, 8 or 9 books or even more in that what is still called a trilogy, and we talk about that.
Increasingly inaccurately titled.
Yes, exactly. And then he also writes as C.K. McDonnell, the Stranger Times books. And interestingly, he publishes the Dublin trilogy books self-published, and the C.K. McDonnell books are trad published. And we talk about that, talk about why he made that decision. And, the efforts that he goes to ensure that the self-published stuff is completely, of a level with the traditionally published stuff in terms of quality and things like that. So it's a really interesting and really fun chat. So
yeah, it's a very fun chat.
We will get straight into it after a quick advert for a writer's notebook, and then we'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat and to let you know about next week's guest.
But for now, on with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just the story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page 1.
I would normally say, did you always want to be a writer? But you started out stand-up comedy and then moved into the world of fiction later on. So, I mean, was comedy or writing fiction your first love, if you like?
Oh, well, I mean, I never thought I could write a book, because I can remember people like that. Because I wrote, I mean, I was a stand-up, and I wrote a lot of TV stuff, and I kind of went through a period where, God, I must have had probably about 10 or 11 scripts optioned for, I think I figured out at one point, but optioned for TV in various different levels, and none of them obviously made it to all the way. So I was kind of always doing that, and people kept asking me about, could you write a book? I said, oh no, look, they're massive. How many words are in them? There's loads of them. God, no. How on earth do you do that? But I never honestly thought I would be. I'm genuinely still now quite surprised. I've done like 15, 16 books, still shocked. But yeah, it's just sort of, I kind of got into it almost by accident, where I had an idea for a thriller book, which I still haven't written, by the way. But I started trying to write that, and then I started trying to write it, realized I didn't know what I was doing. I ended up starting a master's in creative writing in MMU in Manchester, and still haven't finished it, by the way. But I kind of did that just to sort of get myself into prose, and then I started going through prose. And even then, my first book was a short story that got out of control. And I decided, I'm going to write it as a practice novel. Like, I wasn't intended to go anywhere. Mm-hmm. And that's ended up coming up with Bunny McGarry, which is probably the character that most people will associate with for the rest of my life, probably, which is weird but true.
You talk about writing a novel being very different than doing stand-up stuff and comedy stuff, but I mean, it's all, and I can see that's true in the sense of the volume of work and the number of words, as you say, but I suppose it is writing, isn't it? I mean, you must have always had a love of writing and creating things and crafting phrases, etc.
Yeah, I mean, look, I always love the storytelling thing. It is a cliche, but it's true about the Irish that, you know, the storytelling thing is a big part in our culture and stuff like that. And it genuinely is. I mean, honestly, I never thought I could write long form in all seriousness, because this sounds stupid, but my handwriting has always been dreadful, to the point where, like, they sent me to experts and stuff when I was a kid, because my mother, bless her, was a very, very determined woman. And she went, no, he's a smart child. And like, they're going, well, no one can read what he's writing, but he's a smart child. And like, she was literally like, kind of just wouldn't let it go, bless her, and basically kept pushing and saying, no, look, he's clearly intelligent. He's just, you can't read his writing. And so all the way along, like, I could never, I always did anything that had an essay in it and stuff. I did really badly because people couldn't read what I was writing, in all honesty. So I was kind of well turned off the idea by the time I got out of school of ever writing anything, because in that form. So I love stand-up because that was just talking and stuff like that, and TV writing because it was always scripts on things. So I think probably I would have been much more into doing prose, except for the fact that education, frankly, turned me off it. And then, you know, I eventually came back to it. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there is, like, I think the single biggest thing about stand-up comedy that most people don't understand, if you're not close to it, like, even if people don't consciously think this, I think they unconsciously think that a lot of it's being made up on the spot, and because it looks so effortless. Mm-hmm. And it does look so effortless when people do it brilliantly, but the reality is they work their arses off. In fact, it kind of, people find this disappointing or reassuring depending on their mentality, I think. But the biggest thing I can tell you about, because I've known some quite big stand-ups, I've got mates who are, you know, big successful stand-ups, and the thing is they're incredible hard workers. They really are. And some people think, oh, it's because I thought it was sort of effortless, and they're quite disappointed by that. But other people who were kind of maybe are reassured to go, all right, so there is, you work and you get better. It's like, yeah, you have to have the talent, but the talent itself is nothing. You work and you get better, which is really the same as everything I think I've found in life. So, yeah, but stand-up is in itself very different in the approach and stuff, because you can't write a book in the way you write stand-up, or it'll just come across as someone trying desperately to be funny all the time. Mm-hmm. And that gets really tedious. And I've read books that people have written like that, and they are really, frankly, tedious.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've said that, you've said in the past that in your books, the comedy has to serve the plot as opposed to the other way around, essentially.
Yeah, that's a massive thing. I mean, I've sort of said this, but it's always the big thing I think people get wrong. Comedy is not a genre. Comedy is a style. And what I mean by that is it's how you tell the story. But the important reason to think about it that way, I think, is because that way the story always comes first. And if you don't put the story first, and like I think I've even sort of said this kind of half jokingly, people, about if you've somebody walking into a room and the only reason they're walking into the room is because you've got a gag about that room, then close the door, set the building on fire, and start again. You've gone wrong, because they're supposed to be there because they have to be. Like even when I'm writing I'm sitting in my office now, and I have a big pin board here, and I put up cards with all the different scenes on it, and there's never ever a joke on that board because that's not what I do. And to be honest, even if you actually prose writing, the big difference again with stand up is we weirdly did this a couple of years ago, because you got a very strong mailing list. And we asked people, what's your favorite line from any of the books? And like all these people who were like hardcore fans kind of came back, and almost none of them had a line they could actually kind of, because it's a different kind of humor. Like I can give you, 30 Stephen Wright gags, I think are great, or this gags and that gags. But prose that are funny just aren't the same. And there isn't, and it's all about the character, and it's funny because of who's saying it, rather than the line itself.
Yeah. Absolutely, and obviously, was that short story that grew into the first novel? Was that the first book of what you call the Dublin trilogy? We'll get onto that in a minute. But was that a man?
Yeah, that was A Man, One of Those Faces. Yeah, and it was literally, I just had that title. Because a lot of time with short stories and stuff, which I still do now, more for the Stranger Times, which I'm sure we'll come on to explain the different things I do. But I have this where I like doing short stories, and I'll sometimes have like the idea of what the whole story is about. I'll literally sometimes just have a title, and A Man at One of Those Faces, just because I heard someone use that phrase, and I was like, oh, and I had the idea of a bloke who spent his whole life being mistaken for somebody else all the time, or like different people all the time. And I realized when I started writing it that that's a very interesting premise, but nothing's actually happening there. And I had the idea that he would end up visiting dementia patients in hospital and pretending to be who they wanted to be, which again is an interesting idea, but nothing's happening. And the real key, the inciting incident, was one of those patients tries to kill him. That's literally, I can remember where I was sitting when I had that thought. I was in the MMU library, surrounded by people 20 years younger than me who can't feckin' whisper. And I mean, they really can. There's a whole generation that whispering is a lost art form. Don't get me started. But yeah, I can remember where I was, and literally just the whole book then coming out really fast. And I was literally going, by the end of this hour session where I was supposed to be working on a short story, thinking, oh crap, this is a novel. I'm going to have to write it. And I had sort of like big chunks of it came out then. But again, I didn't really know what I was doing when I was writing my first book. You learn a lot from doing your first book. I think that's the big difference between anything. Is your first book and every other book's a big difference, massively different experience, I think. Certainly was for me, because in the first book, you don't know what you're doing. On the second and anything beyond that, you're going, well, I have done this before.
Yeah.
So you have the confidence to know that you can actually do it and stuff. And I think that helps a lot.
And when you came to writing that short story that became a novel, what was it that drew you to that genre, the crime genre? You know, if you're an avid crime reader, have you always liked that kind of stuff?
I mean, it's one of the ones I read, but yeah, it is one of the ones I read and stuff. So I've got a lot of kind of crime books that I do. I'd say it's probably about half of what I read. So I like that sort of genre, but it's kind of weird. I was at a conference over the weekend, and one of the things was a fantasy and science fiction horror stuff in Derby, which is a great conference. But they were talking about crime on one of the panels and stuff. And the reality is crime covers almost everything, because crime by definition is basically just inciting incidents, you know. Yeah. So you can, because a lot of stuff ends up being crime, if you like. But yeah, it's always been an area I've been drawn to. But even then, when I do crime, I don't do it the way most people do crime in any way, shape, or form. I was really I was told by several people, don't like, literally comedy and crime does not mix. People don't like it. When I went looking for an agent, we had no interest. I had one agent bring me in, which in hindsight, I'm pretty sure she was checking if I knew anybody famous who wanted to write a book. So, you know, I was even told by that agent, yeah, you'd have to kind of hide the comedy, and like you do sort of standard crime covers and sort of sneak the comedy in. And I was like, that sounds ridiculous. I was like, and to be honest, I think it comes down to publishing. Honestly, is very conservative in what it thinks will and won't work, and it has these accepted wisdoms that these things don't work. And like there's people like, me and JT Kirk's sells massively, tons of books, and he combines comedy and crime and stuff. Because the reality is people do actually like that kind of thing. And bizarrely, it's like traditional publishing, when I was doing them as an indie, it's like traditional publishing is acting on a bouncer on my behalf, stopping people coming into this area. It's like, no, JD Kirk and Caimh and a couple of others, but that's nobody else. We're not doing any of this. Keep everyone else away from this area. So you end up with people who are big fans of your books just because they can't find anything like it, because weirdly publishing has discouraged people from reading it.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke with James Oswald, and his crime books have a supernatural, paranormal tinge to them, but he says that when they're marketed, essentially they're marketed as straight crime books.
Yeah.
And it is like publishing just doesn't trust people to take a chance on a different kind of story, even though the evidence seems to be there that different approaches or cross genre and stuff like that is actually very popular, but it must just be too difficult for them to think about.
If you then do get big in that area, then they want to shout it from the rooftops that this is a comedy crime book, because we know people like these specific comedy crime books, but no other ones, but these ones specifically are okay. And it's it's a very weird thing.
I remember I asked my agent about the Richard Osman effect, because obviously that book's cozy crime kind of thing, and all that sort of stuff's done brilliantly. Very, very good books. And I was like, was that open up the area a lot more to comedy crime? And he went, to be honest, it's probably got publishing thinking we need to find more celebrities to write books. That's the lesson they seem to have taken from it, which is frankly the wrong one.
Yeah,
because that's like, that obviously got a good start because of who wrote it. But to be clear, those books have done very well in Germany. I was over there recently. They've done really well in Germany and all around the world. And they don't get pointless in Germany. So people keep banging. I do see authors sometimes banging about celebrities writing books. I can understand their thinking to a certain point, but Richard Osman has not sold that many books around the world because he did Pointless. And he sure as hell hasn't got Steven Spielberg interested because it's the guy who sits behind the desk on Pointless. It's because it's a very well-written book that happens to be written by somebody who was previously famous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mentioned it earlier, but that was the first book in what is called the Dublin trilogy, which has then grown arms and legs, I think it's fair to say. But you have kept loyal to that original series title that you have there, despite there being way more than 3 books.
Yeah, well, but basically, it's weirdly looking back on stuff. When I read my first book again recently, I had to read it for a thing, and I was actually surprised that I thought, this is actually. I always thought there'd be loads of things I could spot, as I wouldn't do that again. I was like, well, most of it actually, I think I'm pretty much would stand by. I'm pleased with it. But the thing I really didn't give any thought to was I had an idea for like a 3-book series. I don't know why I decided to call it a trilogy. The biggest mistake I ever made. Biggest piece of advice I give to authors is don't put a number in your series title unless you're really 100% certain. Because basically I had the idea for the 3rd book, and then I realized as I was coming up to writing it that it was actually going to have to be a prequel and then another book. And then what happened is I basically had like a 16-year gap, and I wanted to write sequels to the prequel, which is what I've done. So books 5, 6, and 7 all happened before the first 2, and it's a mess. It's like this. The one thing I will say is, if I was traditionally published, they would not have let me do this, where I'm moving all over the timeline. But I just went, well, look, I'm my own boss. I want to write this book. I think the ideas for the books are strong. People really like the books that are the later books, because they kind of. I established the world from 16 years ago, whatever. Well, back early 2000s, basically. And there's like, kids and stuff in the book because he runs a hurling team, and that are very popular with the readers. And I was like, well, I want to write, and people seem to write reading. And it was worse when you had book 5 in the Dublin trilogy, to be honest. By the time you get to book 7, you can kind of lean into the ridiculousness of it, and it just becomes more distinctive, because we've now stopped getting the emails explaining what a trilogy is. Because we thought of like splitting them up into different series and calling it the Dublin trilogy and all these ideas, and none of it would seem right. So we now literally call it the increasingly inaccurately titled Dublin trilogy.
And I mean, you mentioned it there that you're obviously gone down the self-pubbed route, and I wanted to ask you about that, and specifically, for people out there that are wanting to go down the similar path. What was it that you did? What steps did you take in terms of, editors, cover design, all that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, a big thing, because my missus, who now runs our publishing company, she's, she does that full time. She has for a couple of years. She comes from a publishing background and educational publishing and stuff like that, which is obviously handy in itself. And one of our earliest things was we always wanted to kind of go for the best quality we could when we were doing stuff. So like we got some editing on the first book, as much as you could afford, basically, and we got a very good cover, which is again equally really important to get people to start reading it and stuff. But then as we moved on and the book started being successful, we as a principal spend a lot of money on editing and stuff. I mean, we actually there's been surveys and stuff, and I've seen for a fact that when it comes to how much we spend on editing, we're in the top 1% of indie publishers comfortably. Right. Because what we actually do now is when we got traditional publishing deal with the Stranger Times, we got a brilliant line editor, Rebecca, and we actually, because all traditional publishing houses now, what they've done is they sort of cut back and they outsource all their line editing and stuff. I think they don't have them in house anymore. So because of that, we went, oh, so she works for herself. I said, oh yeah, brilliant. Could we have her email? Because we'd like to get her to do our other books. And they were like, can't think of a reason why we can't give you that. So yeah, we basically, and costs a lot because the rates for like the sort of union rates for line editors, but she does an extremely good job and it's very time consuming. So we're happy to do it because we're conscious of the fact that people have this attitude towards self-publishing that they're lesser and they're not as well produced. So we always, as soon as we could, we wanted to make it to the highest standard possible. And we did that with the audiobooks as well, where, I mean, literally the guy who narrates the Dublin Trilogy audiobooks, Morgan C. Jones, is pretty much the top voiceover guy in Ireland. To the point where every time I go to the cinema in Ireland, he's always on one of the adverts trying to tell us out. Again, we just, he doesn't mind me saying this, but he hasn't complained yet, but he's not cheap. But we wanted to, when things started taking off, we thought, right, we'll reinvest the money to go for the higher standard possible. So I think if people are doing self-publishing or, indie, whatever you want to call it, I think the important thing is, obviously, don't spend money you don't have. But if you have the money, and people always think, if you had money for marketing, what would you spend it on? I'd spend it on an editor. That's what I'd spend it on. Mm-hmm. Because people have this idea they can give X amount of money to a PR person, an editor and stuff, or a PR person or a marketing person. The reality is, it's very hard to get an instant turnaround from those things. But what you need to do is make the very best product you can make, then worry about getting it in front of people. Because even the editor we got on the first book, like we got a guy called Scott Pack as the sort of overview editor, if you like, who's brilliant. And I didn't know who he was, and only afterwards I realized he'd done all this stuff in the industry and all that. And we got him in, and he was great. He gave me some really good advice, especially for a first-time author. And he also said, "Look, this is good." Like, he was really nice to us. He said, "Look, I've done a lot of this. This is good." Like, he actually said, "Do you want a publishing deal?" Because I know people. After we've done it, it's like, "Well, we've bought a cover now." And even then, when it came out, like the first couple of months, I thought, I shouldn't have done this myself. And then my wife, bless her, started taking over and literally approaching bloggers and going, look, he'll write something for you if you're a blog, and get him on board and stuff. Because bloggers are great people, but my God, they get completely inundated with stuff, bloggers. Authors don't realize that bloggers are really, people do it because they love reading, and they end up being burned out by the process because it's so overwhelming. But Scott basically told us, get this in front of people and good things will happen, was his piece of advice at the end. And that's kind of what we did. But as long as you get the book to as best it can be, then you can worry about doing that, because the whole point is then you don't want to miss the opportunity. Like, you need the book to be as good as you can, because you don't get a second chance. We're in a world where there's Netflix and there's Prime Video, there's all this stuff, there's so many books, there's so much stuff. When you get the chance to get somebody's time, you cannot be wasting it, ever. Mm-hmm.
And is there more of a pressure when you're doing that sort of indie publishing to get the next product out quickly, rather than the sort of traditional year to 18-month gap in trad publishing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of ways you can look at it. Yeah, there is. I mean, in certain indie circles, there's this thing about how fast you need to be producing stuff and all that stuff. And look, if people want to do that, good luck. I think it's, especially for newer, I've seen like newer authors thinking, I'm doing a 7-book series. And you go, have you written a book yet? And you go, no, write the first book. Like, literally don't. There's always people running ahead because they start. I think it's one of the dangers if you're in these kind of groups and you're people talking about marketing and stuff and how they do, I'm writing a book in a week, and you go, well, good luck to you, but I'm not, and I'm not going to do that. You need to learn what you can do and the best way of doing that. So, I mean, in the upside of indie is you have the flexibility where you can release stuff basically whenever you want.
Mhm.
So, like, I've had years where I've had 4 books come out, and then I've had years where 1 or 2 books came out over the last, and it varies. A lot of the time when there was lesser stuff, it's because I was writing the book that was traditionally published, which comes out a year later. Which is, like I will finish a traditionally published book. I know in one of the last couple of years, finished a traditionally published book, then wrote 2 or 3 other books that came out before it, and then the traditional book because it's a year in advance. So yes, there is. I think there's that pressure if you're not careful about who you're following and what you're paying attention to. But my attitude towards it is it gives me the flexibility that if I have an idea and I finish the book, that we can do it and we can get it out. You can certainly get it out much quicker than traditional publishing does it. Mm-hmm. So it's I know there's good and bad to it. But like, for example, I've got like 16 books out now, and obviously 3 of them are traditionally published, but the rest of them, I would never, if I was traditionally published and my first book came out it would have been 2017 at least before it came out. Mm-hmm. I'd have 2018. I'd have maybe 5 books out now, and that's if things had gone really well. So I got to build a following a lot faster. And one of the problems with traditional publishing, frankly, is that the year model it's a long time in this day and age for people to be waiting for the next thing, especially if you've only got 1 book out. Which is why I do things like short stories. I do short stories for the Stranger Times where I make them into a podcast and stuff. And I've kind of built up the world of it, both in the books themselves, where the short stories let me expand on the world and really kind of let me think it through, which is great. But it also gives some people other things to go to so that they're kind of kept in the ecosystem. So when it comes back around, they're there for you, which I think is really important.
Yeah, it's true, because I mean, that is a problem. A debut writer who even has sort of mild success, if they're waiting a year to 18 months for the next book, then there's been so many other debuts or whatever that have come out in that time that you can easily be forgotten in the crowd. So
yeah, especially because, I mean, frankly, trad publishing is heavily focused towards debut authors. And like I said, my 4th trad book's coming out in January, so I've sort of been round it now, where you see the big, even you walk into Waterstones, there's the big debut thing where they're shoving it out and there's masses of the stuff, and there's literally piled high. But that's kind of because you kind of realize what that is. It's because they've bet big on that book. So they need to get lots of that book out. So it ends up being a self-fulfilling thing to a certain point, at least initially. But yeah, there is you kind of have to know how trad works, especially if you're doing like a series, because the reality is you don't get the same, banging of the drum and stuff for the 2nd and 3rd book by any means. It's just not what happens for anybody, really. But at the same time, a series, if it is doing well, publishers love that, because people will find the first book and then go and read all the other ones, which is that's their dream scenario, where people keep going and buying the next book the next week.
Yeah.
But yeah, trad's a bit weird. Is it? You have to get used to trad and kind of know what it is, or else it could wreck your head, frankly.
Yeah.
I would like to ask you about that then. Why you? Because I as you said, you do have a couple of books out now, traditionally published. What was it then that knowing what you'd learned in the self-published world, what was it that made you think, I'll give that one that go a try?
I mean, it was basically because I got my agent Ed, who's great, and the Dublin books were dealing with like the foreign rights and all that sort of stuff as well, which is good. But it was like, do something else, and we liked the idea of being hybrid in the sense that we wanted to be with trad, because it kind of, frankly, it means you're in bookstores, you do hit a different area of readers, because when you're indie. People certainly do buy paperbacks and stuff, but the vast majority of your sales are going to probably be Kindle. In fact, at this point, we outsell on audio. We sell, audiobooks have really been big in the last year for us. And we're actually outselling, I'd say, audiobooks to paperbacks now as well on the indie side of stuff, which I think was really interesting, because again, in Audible, people don't know. People would no idea that we did those ourselves, because the quality of them is, we stand by them. They're really good. We've spent a lot of time getting it right with Morgan, our narrator. But yeah, so I guess we just wanted to be in a different area, and it's, we wanted to, because, when you are trad published, frankly, it's much easier to get reviews in the big papers and all that sort of stuff. You get into the bookshops, you can get into Waterstones and stuff, which you can do as an indie, but frankly, unless you're somebody who's massive as an indie, like LJ Ross does it, which she's an audio, she's got her books into bookshops. which is amazing. But LJ Ross is selling like, I think it's 8 million or something. Louise is that now? She's extraordinary, she's incredible, like success. She's an amazing. She's one of the biggest. She should be one of the biggest stories in publishing now. But unless you're anybody else, it's kind of. I think everybody tries to do it when they're indie. They try and get books into a bookshop and they go through all the hoopla. And it's one of these things that after you jump through quite a lot of hoops, you quickly realize, this isn't worth the effort. Especially when you're running a business. Like I was really lucky. We got one of my books, the third book, got picked up by the biggest book club in Ireland and made their book of the month. And that was an amazing thing. But we got into bookshops in Ireland because of that and stuff. But even then, it didn't really establish what we thought it would, which is a shame. But then the traditional book publishing and bookshops are kind of linked together. In reality, that's the thing they are. So it made sense that way to get in that way. And it's what's been really good is initially we had a lot of people from the Bunny McGarry books, the Dublin trilogy, coming over to the Stranger Times, because it is a thing we were talking about earlier on that, that author, and they were hiding the supernatural element in crime books.
Yep. There
is a danger in that, though. You will get some readers who just like read the book, they're enjoying it, and then something turns up that's supernatural.
Right.
They go, how dare you? Because some crime fans are very wary about going into other areas. They like crime. Whereas if you get fantasy fans, they generally are much more willing to try a more crime book. So we've had like people go over from the Bunny books into the Stranger Times because they were like fans of my writing. We just said, look, this is different, but it's the same voice. It's written by Caimh. You enjoy that, you'll probably enjoy this. And we got a lot of nice reviews and people going, wouldn't normally read this kind of book, but I really enjoyed it. We got a couple from people going, it's nonsense, which is fair enough. They gave it a shot. But what's been lovely now is you've seen them coming back the other way now as well, where people who've read the Stranger Times books are coming back and finding the Bunny books, which is great. And it's just sort of one hand washing the other. And it was always our idea that would be the hope. And that is definitely happening. So I think in that regard, I think it's definitely worth, looking at your options and having a foot in both camps.
And with the with the Stranger Times books, you publish those under CK McDonnell. Was that a publisher thing? Was that your decision? Why did you? Or is it just because they're a different type of story and you just wanted to differentiate that way?
A little from all of the above, to be honest. Where I wanted to keep the Caimh McDonnell books separate from the Stranger Times books because just boring things like on Amazon and stuff, it will cause a bit of confusion and people won't quite understand what they're getting. They also they were terrified of Caimh, literally the word Caimh. Despite the fact they said, look, it's written on the front of a book. People just need to know how to spell it and they can get the book. They don't have to know how to pronounce it. But they were genuine. But my editor's a lovely man, but he's also one of the most English human beings I've ever met in my life. And I can remember they brought us for a lunch, him, my agent Ed, and myself and Ed had already discussed about giving it a different name. And Simon, bless him, was like, could we possibly, maybe we shouldn't, but if we could we? And it's like going, he's going to die before the end of this sentence from a lack of oxygen unless we sort of go, if you're talking about the name, Simon, it's fine. We can use something else. So we use CK, which incidentally, my dad got very genuinely annoyed about, God rest his soul. Because I didn't realize this, but he was like, I didn't understand the way we're on conversation. We didn't even understand why someone was annoyed. But he basically Caimh is short for Caimhine, which is the original of Kevin. So I think I put C/K McDonnell as like we could use those initials. And Ed, my agent, went, CK, that sounds good. And just put CK. And I was like, okay, I don't care. But my dad, bless him, was like, that's not your name. That is not your second name is not that. You're named after such and such, who was a friend of mine. And he was very annoyed that my second name was, But basically, it was just because of that, and because people, frankly, the publisher was terrified of Caimh. It's the short answer.
And in this new series that you're writing, you reference kind of real life books like the Zombie Survival Guide by Max Brooks. Is it you quite enjoy kind of? I guess it's not really breaking the fourth wall, but is that kind of touchstones to real life things a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I do that. Yeah, it's like I literally in the fourth book, which is coming out in January, I have somebody with a copy of when they're being attacked by zombies with a copy of his guide, and it's because it's a hilarious thing about research that I kind of know. I always have a fun, hilarious disregard for research. Like I really enjoy Like, I actually wrote the scene deliberately this way, where I thought it'd be really funny if one of them has the zombie survival guide. And then I'd actually read it years ago. I like his World War Z. The audio, if anyone gets a chance, the audio version of the World War Z is incredible because it's all different actors doing different bits. It's amazing. But so I was a big fan of his work, and like but the zombie survival guide, I deliberately got a copy. I was sitting right where I am right now in my office. I was writing the scene near the end, and I thought, I'm just going to keep skimming through and picking things out. And there's all these things about if you have access to a helicopter, automatic weapons, and it basically then the whole thing in the thing was this guy just skipping through and going, "Has that him a helicopter? Are we even going to?" And ended up being so much more fun then, just rather than like just doing that as the ridiculousness of it. Because as a general rule with the Stranger Times, and I kind of fell into this by accident, but I love doing it. Everything exists in that world. All the zombie movies, all the vampire movies and stuff. Because I always think it's so bizarre in any kind of fiction where they're going, there's this person, but they don't seem themselves. They seem sort of, I don't know what word you'd use. It's like zombie. We all know it's a zombie. Just call it a fucking zombie.
I always love that when they go out their way to not use the word
a walker
zombie,
or
a
whatever.
walker, as if the word zombie doesn't exist in this universe.
Yeah, and I think I did it actually weirdly. I do something similar with the Bunny books where my characters will reference TV shows, and like Bridget is one of the main characters in it, and she's an obsessive crime fan, like a fan of books. And I think it's really funny that she's comparing it. I think it's funny, but it also weirdly helps with the kind of sense of reality to it, because instead of just following a conventional crime story, if something happens, they're referring to what it would be like in a conventional crime story. And it almost, you go, oh, well, then you don't really know what's happening. If they're deliberately referring to, if this was like that, this is what would happen. And it's like, there's a lot of fun. Like, even just, you can have one of the best places you can find humor is by acknowledging the tropes of the genre. Because I think that can be a lot of fun, because you got like readers love that as well, because they know what the tropes are, and they love the fact that you've given them respect to know they know. And you can have a lot of fun with that as well. So I always
it's something that I've always loved in the Scream movies, how they're so self-referential about what a horror movie is and how a sequel has to work, and they openly talk about things that have to happen in a sequel or a trilogy, and it's all kind of poking fun at it and stuff. And
it's brilliant, and the audience really enjoy that because they feel like they're in the thing with you, because they're like in on the joke rather than you trying to. So I think it's great. I love doing that.
And I wanted to ask a bit about your process as well, because obviously you mentioned earlier that you're sitting beside, we can't see it as we record this, but you're sitting beside a board with lots of Post-its and stuff stuck on it. I mean, are you a big planner before you start writing your books then?
I'm kind of a mix, I would say, in the sense that I need to have enough of the jigsaw puzzle. It's like having the corners and stuff. So I need to know, when I start writing, I need to know what the first maybe 7 or 8 chapters are. And then I need to sort of have a vague idea what's going to happen. Obviously, the overall theme of the thing. Sometimes I have the ending, sometimes I don't. But I need to have enough of the pieces, because I find then what happens is I start writing the first few chapters. And once you start writing it, it's like that, everyone has a plan till they get punched in the face. That Tyson quote about, it's the same as when you're writing a book. Everyone thinks they're, but then you get stuck into it, and then when you have it, then you can adapt to it. So you start when I'm writing the book, then my brain is fully focused on the book I'm writing, and then when my brain starts working away at it, other bits, it starts filling in ahead of me. So what usually happens is I'm writing like the first 5 or 6 chapters. By the time I'm finished that, my brain is filled in the next chunk, and it's got the ending sorted out in its head, and and it's sort of. And generally, I get to the point where I'll stop a couple of times for like a day, maybe, and kind of have a look at the board and reorganize some stuff. But generally, once I start writing, I'm kind of doing like a chapter or 2 a day, and it's just sort of rolling on because my brain is working ahead of me, which is, very, very handy.
And how do you draft? Do you find you kind of have quite a clean first draft, or is that kind of process mean you kind of have a rough draft that you then edit down?
Well, generally, one of the biggest things I do is I start every day reading what I wrote the day before. So I go over the day before. So by the time I get to the end of it, then it's actually pretty clean. Because generally, like what will happen is I'll have gone through it, and then at some point, usually about 2/3 of the way through, this was never deliberate, but it seems to be, I've noticed it consistently. Before I get into the final act, I think I have a tendency to download the whole thing, read through the whole thing, make some notes on it again, and clean it up as I'm going. Um, and then I write this sort of the finale, because the finale always comes out in a bit. It's always it's the hardcore writing for days and days and days straight because I'm near the end and it's exciting for me. So yeah, by the end of it, then it ends up becoming pretty clean. I say pretty clean. Then I'll give it to my wife as like my zero editor. So she'll read it, she'll clean the whole thing up, and then it goes to developmental editor and line editor and stuff. So there's still loads of stuff, but the actual structure and the story is there. Mm-hmm. And most of the time, occasionally you have to like throw in the only big change I usually make is somebody will point out and go, it'd be great to know a bit more about this person or a bit more about that. Yeah. So what often happens is, like in the last Stranger Times book, I think I stuck in one short chapter and I edited another chapter, just added a little bit more color just to flesh out a couple of points. But that was really the only things. Generally, they end up being quite clean by the end.
And you mentioned that you've got a literary agent. At what stage in this whole journey did you get an agent then?
I think I got it about 3 or 4 books. Maybe my 4th book was in. I started looking at various agents, and they kind of, we'd had a bit of interest from like kind of telly people in America and stuff. And that was, I kind of used that as a good point to go, well, this is a good introduction to agents. Go, look, we've had this thing, and we've got, a couple of queries about foreign rights and stuff. So it was probably relatively early in the process. I mean, in the sense that it's about, because then I started looked at a couple of different agents, and I had serious talks with a couple of them before I went with Ed. But I mean, people always, I think when authors are looking for agents, that you really cannot take that process personally. And it's only when you're like, literally when you have an agent, and I kind of genuinely myself and Ed get on really well, and I'll have a chat with him and stuff. And you can ask any agent, they'll tell you this, how much stuff, like the physical amount of stuff they get in a week. Yeah. When you're not, because Ed, I tried to get an agent when I first started doing my first book, tried to get an agent and got no interest. Ed was one of the people that I don't think ever got back to me. And I think I found the original email I sent him to go and sent it to him one day last year. Go, by the way, this is the first email I ever sent you. You still haven't responded to it, you prick. And he was just sort of laughing it off and stuff. But yeah, so I got one about that point in the process, and I think they're, I know some people don't bother getting them at all if they're indie and stuff, but I think with things like foreign rights and stuff, him and Helene from the agency do a brilliant job on that, and things like TV and stuff. I think you need somebody who knows the lay of the land, and frankly, I can be refreshingly direct, which is a nice way of phrasing it. The other way of phrasing it is a bull in a china shop. So having having Ed there to go, I'll say what you just told me to say, but I'm going to say it in a much nicer way, because he's a very charming man. So I think it's just in a lot of ways that agents make a lot of sense. Particularly, I have a great relationship with mine. But yeah, it's been invaluable. But yeah, once you get to a certain point, you definitely do need one, I think.
Yeah, and you've written your different series are, there's different settings for them. Obviously, Dublin for the Dublin trilogy, but you've also written books in America and Stranger Times in Manchester and stuff. Yeah. Do you enjoy visiting these different places as you write these things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Dublin is obviously where I grew up, and I live in Manchester now. And I actually wrote a book in America before I'd ever written one in Manchester. And it was weird because I kind of felt bad about, why don't I write something here? And then the Stranger Times, which is the sort of fantasy paranormal one, it just sort of all clicked together, where the idea was like a sort of low-end version of the 14 Times that I had years ago for a sitcom script that went nowhere. And then it was literally, Manchester was where I lived at the time. I walked from I always had an office outside the house because I could never work in the house. And I was walking from my flat to the office. I was going, it's in Manchester. And I was literally, their office is in a converted church that the church is based on is on my way to my office. It all just sort of was spiraled together and made perfect sense. But yeah, I love that. I like Dublin. Is just like going home. It's great. Like I have obviously do a bit of research for bits and pieces, but the fact is I'm from Dublin, so even if it's wrong, I'm going to go with my version of it. But because I have got stuff wrong about Dublin, and people that get very annoyed at me about it. I'm going, yeah. Now I just go, it's multiverse. It's my version of Dublin. Yeah, exactly. There you go. I think that's the greatest cop ever, and I love it. So yeah, it's my fun way of going home, really. I mean, obviously, I do also go home, but yeah. And then the American thing. I was always fascinated by America growing up as a kid. I'm a big NFL fan and all these sort of things. And I think it's just it's a fascinating place, America, for all the good and bad that's in America. I still think it's an incredible place. So, and I just love the idea, frankly, of taking Bunny McGarry. One of the big driving things behind the American books was Bunny was sort of, he knew everything. Like he knew Dublin backwards. He's from Cork, but the whole idea was he kind of knew Dublin backwards, and it just seemed then like so great, the idea of, well, let's just take him out of what where he has all this knowledge and sort of thing, and shove him somewhere where he is really a fish out of water. And he's sort of like, the whole thing was supposed to be like my semi sort of Jack Reacher type thing. But I've discovered what Lee Child can write. Lee Child can write a bloke who just doesn't have many friends and turns up somewhere. I've discovered, whatever it says about me, that every time I write a book, I keep coming up with characters that are supposed to be small characters, and they end up getting bigger parts, and then they end up hanging around. And I end up literally with, like, basically, I use this analogy, but it's true. You know that scene in The Muppets Take Manhattan? They're in the car, they're picking one of them up, and they start picking up the rest of the Muppets, and they're all in the back of the car. There's more and more of them getting into the car. That's what my books are like. I keep picking these people up, and I can't get rid of any of them. So my books end up just being full of characters that I just can't let go.
And see, when you're writing these kind of long series of books, and you've got different characters and different routes in, I suppose, for new readers, are you always conscious about someone might be jumping on here halfway through? Do you always have to kind of leave a way in, a back door in for people so they don't get lost?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the big tricky things, particularly I would say probably more with the Stranger Times, because there's a lot going on in the Strange Times books, because it's a band of 7 journalists, working on this thing. So there's ends up being like there'll be a B and a C plot and stuff, and I had this idea of making them sort of standalone-ish, but that's very hard to do in a series. So I think it's one of these things where in a lot of series they kind of reintroduce things every time, which you do to a certain point. You just have to, it's one of these things where you have to balance it, where you don't want to bore people who know, but you have to also people need to be reminded occasionally of stuff. But like I won't name the author. There's a series of books I'm a big fan of. They're kind of like thrillers, and they're great, and they're brilliantly written books. Like, when you to get over the fact that every time you start reading one, he reintroduces the character every time, and it's like, just okay. All right, I know what you're doing it, but I've never seen someone bang it quite that hard. So, like, for example, if I'm honest, like, I think my first, like the second book, you could pick up This Charming Man and you'd get everything. Love Will Tear Us Apart was the third book in the series, but because it ended up concluding a lot of stuff that happened in the first 2, in all honesty, while I did recap it and stuff, I was like, if anyone was trying to, I was like, well, read the first one. Like, this is not a good one to jump on.
Yeah.
And then, but the fourth book is, I think you can get in there again, and you can kind of get it. So it's a thing. I've seen Ben Aranovich talk about it as well, because they talk about jumping on points and stuff like that. I think, and he said in his books, he said, to be honest, there are books that are good jumping on points and not good jumping on points. And while the ideal is every book needs to be a good jumping on point, and it is something you always have to be thinking about, the reality is, to serve the story properly, you can't just go back and recap. So some books won't be, and you just have to sort of go, well, that one isn't, but that's where we are.
And would you want to go back to writing scripts and that sort of thing, or are you happy in the world of books?
I think, to be honest, everything's been optioned for TV and stuff, which is cool, and I've not really had very little to do with any kind of scripts that people are coming up with and stuff. I think a couple of years ago when I first got optioned, I had no interest in doing the TV thing, because I spent a lot of time doing that, and frankly, not getting anywhere, not getting to the finish line. Mm-hmm. I mean, whatever about writing books, TV writing, it can be soul destroying, because you can spend a year working on a script and it just doesn't go anywhere. And especially in Britain, it gets read by 3 people who are the ones in power. And if you can't get them on board, then good night, it's a waste of time. Whereas I like writing a book thinking, whatever's happening, this book's coming out. Even if, God forbid, my publishers who I get on great with, if they decide they don't want it, they can't stop me publishing it. So yeah, I think though, maybe now I'm at the point where I maybe might get back to that and stuff. And there's a mate of mine, Phil Mealy, I helped him writing, he's done a musical on Making a Murderer, that did really well in Edinburgh and stuff. And I know there was a lot of interest. I haven't heard from him recently. I'm going to speak to him next week about what's going on. But I was writing that with him for a while. And then he kept going with it, and I had to go and sort of book stuff came up that I had to do. But I enjoy doing that. I might write a play and stuff. I think there's a play idea I have that I really like that I want to do with Phil at some point. And maybe I will look at doing scripts and some of the TV things in the future, depending on what happens and where they currently are. But we'll see. I don't know is the honest answer. But put it this way, it was the definite no 2 years ago. Now it's like, maybe.
So what have you got lined up next? You've got the fourth Stranger Times book coming out. What else is in the pipeline?
Yeah, that's coming out in end of January. I'm writing a bunny book now, which is the fourth McGarry Stateside, because basically there was going to be, it's a whole different book that was going to be the fourth one, because basically I couldn't write that because the pandemic happened. I don't know if you've seen the news, but there was a wall there, no one could leave their house. So research became really, and that idea would have been weird. It was just very research intensive, that idea that was going to be that book. And I was kind of stuck then because I thought, well, I'm not going to write that book because I get it wrong. And then I came up with a novella idea. This happens a lot, where I came up with an idea for a short thing that ends up becoming a novel. That's happened to me in my first ever book. It happened to me. There's a Welcome to Nowhere. It's a standalone thing with actually secondary characters from the McGarry Stateside series. There was a short story called Smithy's Revenge. People kept saying, that feels like it's just the start of a thing. I was like, yeah, it does, doesn't it? So I ended up writing that whole thing as a very odd novel that I really enjoyed. And I've done that a couple of times. And then what I'm doing now is McGarry Stateside book 4 was supposed to be a novella that I just came up with an idea for, that literally starts with them trying to find a toilet, which is a great inciting incident for a crime thriller, but somebody just desperately needing a loo. But I'm writing that'll come out before Christmas. And then, I mean, to be honest, I think it's one of these things people always think ideas are such a big thing. Ideas are 10 a penny. It's the actually converting them. Yeah. I have ideas for like the next 3 bunny books waiting to go. So it's just a question of finding the time. And I think I'm going to try and find the time, hopefully in the next year or so, to write something that's neither of those two things, just to do something different, because I genuinely really enjoy writing. I always feel, it was at a conference at the weekend actually, and I always feel bad because I think this happens. You might notice this at writers' conferences, but writers can be quite negative with people asking about the whole publishing process and the whole writing process. Yeah. I think it just sort of happened. Like I was there this weekend again. You don't want to, but I was like, I love writing books. I genuinely do. I think I come up to my office. I'm never like, oh, here we go. I enjoy it. I think especially how I write, I have to enjoy it almost, because there has to be a sense of play. And this is my sense of play. I get to tell myself stories. I sit in a room and tell myself stories. And the only person I discuss it with until it's finished is the dog. And that I love doing that. I think it's a wonderful thing to do. And people say, I mean, this isn't what you're running close to what you're asking, but I'm going to say it now because it's in my head. Because I do know, like, people talk about how hard it is to get a publishing deal and stuff like this. And look, it is. I'm not saying it isn't by any means. But the thing is, these things have always been hard. It's like people talk about, stand-up comedy. It's so hard to get into stand-up comedy now. Like, yeah, but these things have always been hard. Are they harder than they were? Maybe. But don't focus on the thing about it being hard. Because if you focus on the problem, then the problem becomes all you think about. What you need to do is do it as well as you can and then see what happens. And not like you can't, I think people are worrying about a publishing deal before they've written a book, and they're worried about, they're doing a 5-minute stand-up set and they're worried about, is it going to be hard to get on TV?
Yeah.
And all this. And the reality is you have to first get really good and enjoy the thing, and then worry about everything else. And I do think there's a real tendency now. And like when I saw, a very good author talking about, it's the industry's this, that, and the other. And I can see why he's had bad experiences, clearly. But I saw a room full of hopeful writers, and you could see their faces like, oh, this is. And I was like, and I just think we focus on that side of things too much. I think we should embrace that it's an enjoyable thing, and you can make a good living. Lots of people are. We know that. So,
Yeah, and arguably there's it might be difficult to get a publishing deal, but at the same time, there are more routes into it now with things like indie publishing and stuff like that as well. So
there's an abundance of ways in. So just worry about being good at it, and then you can. I mean, indie does favor certain things. It favors people who write series more or less, and people who maybe write faster than one book a year. It does favor that because you can get the best advert is your next book and stuff. But the point is, there's lots of different ways in, exactly as you said. And depending on what you want out of the process and stuff, there's lots of different ways you can go. And nobody on their deathbed has ever regretted writing a book. Do you know what I mean? That's something you go, you should be proud of yourself for doing that. That's a cool thing that you've achieved. And people should just embrace it and enjoy it, and maybe not worry so much about the negative side of it, especially in the early stages, I think.
What was the last book that you read?
I'm currently reading Ben Aranovic's Winter's Gift, which is great as always. Before that, actually, the last one I finished was Small Mercies by Dennis Lehane, who is incredible. He's just an amazing writer, and that is a superb book.
Brilliant. What about the last film that you watched?
The last film I watched actually was, for the second time, the Dungeons and Dragons film, which, by the way, is superb.
Yeah,
I don't know if you've seen it, but
I loved it.
That's it. Everyone I speak to who's seen it loved it, and yet weirdly, it wasn't a flop by any means, but it didn't do. I think they got the marketing horribly wrong in it. Because I was like, I don't know about you, but I was watching it going, and I used to be a big superhero film fan, and I'll be honest, the last few that have come out, I went to see Guardians of the Galaxy because that was quality. But a lot of the few, not even so much their quality, but also I found myself not being that bothered about going to see them.
Yeah.
And I think that was a big, because I was like, if they're losing me, they're in trouble, because I was going to see all these things. And I think that is honestly, but I saw Dungeons and Dragons and went, this is going to be the next 10 years of cinema. Like the big, we will have fantasy films where they believe they can do these things, because it's like the gags I don't say gag, but the humor, and it's great, and they really work. I mean, I watched it the second time, you go. And the invention that allowed the writers to have, like the heist do you remember the thing with the mirror and the portal and all that sort of stuff? I don't care what anyone says. That's a superb bit of cinema. Yeah. It's brilliantly fun. And even a friend of mine, Sarah, who's no interest in fantasy stuff, went to see it twice in the cinema because she said, I just laughed my ass off the first time, and it was laughed the second time again because it was just fun. So if anyone's seen that, I highly recommend it.
I've heard good things about it.
I think you're right. I think there's something about the way they marketed it, or there's maybe still, people don't want to be associated with Dungeons and Dragons in some way or something. I think people off going or something.
There was part of that. I think a parody came out opposite Super Mario Brothers, which was just a juggernaut because of the thing. So, and it was a few different things, but what was interesting, like the reviews have been great for it.
Yeah.
And I've basically, even because I've been taking an interest in it, because I had an idea for a film in that area that I would, I don't even know if I'd ever come to write it, but I'd love to pitch it. But, and I was like, because I assumed Dungeons and Dragons when I saw the reviews, and it was a big film, and like I saw it and saw how good it was, I thought, well, this was a smash hit. And then I looked into it and went, oh no, it wasn't a smash hit. I mean, it's done okay.
Yeah, it
should have been a smash hit, but I think basically the studio kind of acknowledged that. Yeah, we may have not done this right. We need to look at why we did it, because the film is so good. I'm really hopeful when it goes on streaming, because people are more inclined to give it a shot if they're just sitting in their house and they're especially when it goes, like, it'll eventually be free somewhere like Prime or something in a year, 6 months time, and I think then you'll see people. It'll really get a second wind, and I think there'll be more of them because it's too good not to do again. It was just too good.
Yeah, I agree. What about the last TV show that you watched or are watching?
I'll tell you what I'm loving, where we finished it now, but Colin from Accounts, if you've not seen it, the Australian sitcom. It's great. I did see people recommending it, and it's really good. It's basically, I mean, you technically would call it a romantic comedy. It's about two people getting together, but it's really, it's not in this, it's sort of taken that and turned it on its head. It's very beautifully written comedy, just really well drawn characters, and the two of them sort of bumping up together, in awkward ways. And it's great. I'm a big fan of it. I think it's a fantastic piece of writing. And I think it's already been I think it's a bit underground hit, but I think more and more people are hearing about it because it's just really good.
Nice. Is that on one of the streaming services?
I think it's just on iPlayer. So it's
okay.
Pretty much everyone, I think, has access to that. So it's great. Highly recommended.
Right. And the very, very last thing we always do is a super quick fire either or, and I always say there's no right answer here apart from perhaps one of them, but we'll start off with Terry Pratchett or Ben Aranovich.
I was gonna say whoever the second one is losing. I mean, because look, I mean, Ben's brilliant. I love his work, and he's a great bloke and stuff. But Terry Pratchett gave me my love of reading, so it's Terry Pratchett against anybody, it's always going to be Terry Pratchett, I'm afraid. I mean, I literally, hang on a sec. You won't be able to, this is good podcasting, but this is my bust of Sir Terry Pratchett that I have sitting beside me at all times. And it's got his own hat and his own glasses that come off. And when I'm writing, his glasses are on because then I'm being serious. And when I'm on a break, his glasses are off because then it's fun time Caimh.
What about TV or cinema?
Ooh, I'll have to go TV now, I think, yeah.
Night owl or early bird?
Used to be a night owl, then I gave up being a stand-up comedian, and it freaks my wife out now that I go to bed at like 11:15, and she's like, "Oh, okay," because I used to be 5 a.m. So yeah, I'm a former night owl now, early bird, I guess. Yeah.
Excellent. Music or no music when you're writing?
Oh, I can't have music on when I'm writing. I've tried that. The only thing I could listen to is with no lyrics. I'm like Michael Stipe, he's making an album. I can't be listening to somebody else's work.
And the last one, real book or ebook?
You'd be pleased to hear, I know this is a close personal thing to you, I actually mostly read on Kindle, if I'm entirely honest.
Fantastic. That's good to hear. Excellent.
Excellent.
I think there's 5 of us now. We
should get jackets made.
Tattoos, I think. Tattoos, yeah.
The Kindle plant. No, I was going to say that's not good letters. The Kindle cool kids.
Yeah, maybe not. Yeah, no, thanks very much. That was a lot of fun.
Cheers. Thanks very much for having me. It was delightful.
That was great.
So, have you seen the D&D film yet, Tarek?
No, I've not seen it yet. I have heard genuinely nothing but good things about it, and it's on Paramount Plus now, so I have no excuse not to watch it.
No, I would definitely, like Caimh was saying, it's a lot. I thought it was a lot better than some of the more recent superhero fare, you know.
Yeah, and to be fair, I know it's not done very well. Although a lot of good stuff doesn't seem to be doing well at the moment. I don't know if it has been lumped into the whole, superhero fatigue, which seems to be in play.
Yeah,
or something. I don't know.
I mean, I think, as we discussed there at the end, but Caimh, it was a number of factors that came out against the Super Mario movie, which did much better than everyone thought. And then also, I think they didn't really market it as much as they could have, because it is Dungeons and Dragons, maybe, and there's still
maybe a tough sell to wide
although I don't really know why, because you've got like Lord of the Rings,
Stranger Things.
There's a lot of fantasy stuff that is more popular, Game of Thrones and all that sort of stuff.
And that's so that's things like Stranger Things specifically.
Yeah, exactly.
They play the D&D. It's a part of the story, isn't it? So yeah, I know. And also, I mean, comic books, movies are massive, and that can't really get much nerdy than that.
No, exactly.
So.
Anyway, I highly recommend it, and it is now streaming. So yeah, if you haven't seen it, definitely do that. But I thought it was interesting what he was saying about, how he treats comedy not as a genre but just as a style. So you could put comedy in any type of story if it's done well, but it always has to serve the story, really.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting way to look at it. And there's no genre which you can't write in a funny slant or manner if you want to take that angle. And as you say, as long as the story's being served properly and it's not just at the expense of it, I think there's no reason why you can't have super dark humor in. Sometimes the funniest moments are inappropriate or come out of left field in a dark movie, and you catch unaware.
Exactly.
Of it,
Or even like The Sopranos, which was a pretty serious show at times, also had a lot of stupid, funny moments in it as well.
Think of the episode when the Christopher,
the Pine Barrens,
chased the guy in the forest.
One of the best bits
one of my
TV
favorite.
I've ever seen.
Exactly.
The interior decorator.
That's right.
So if you haven't seen that episode of The Sopranos, I also recommend that.
But fantastic.
And also sort of publishing's attitudes to that, and being, it doesn't surprise me. I think he's right in what he says about publishing being the industry generally being quite conservative with the small c, in terms of what it wants to publish. And it's only when something out of the ordinary does well that it suddenly says, oh, well, maybe that does work, and then that's what they look for.
I mean, it's something we've chatted about countless times, and but how often do you get a breakout book and then suddenly every book's got a very similar front cover for the next 3, 4, 5 years because it's just created this boom. And yeah, it's I honestly think the way to do it is not to have an eye on marketing, know what kind of stuff sells and what stuff doesn't, but ultimately write the book you want to write, and don't pander or chase a perceived trend, I think.
Yeah, and also, I suppose, related to that, as he was saying, if you're self-publishing, make the book as good as it can be. Spend the money on an editor and things like that, rather than on the marketing, because you want to make the product as best as it can be, so that if it does get in front of people, they like it and they're impressed by it, rather than turning out a product that isn't so good, but you have adverts for it everywhere. That's it. You might get a lot of sales initially, but then it'll drop off very quickly if you do that sort of thing.
Yeah. No, 100%. No, that was a great chat, Caimh.
Yeah, it
very
was
fun and some excellent advice.
Yeah. Really good fun to have on the podcast as well. So yeah, you can get all his books. We'll put links in the podcast description. And before we get to next week's guest, we have that rare thing, Tarek, an email. Yes, from a listener. Although I have to say we're late to this as well, because this email came in after the Lauren Bucas episode that we did recently.
Sorry, Mum. We should get back to you soon.
No, it's not your mum even either.
It's not my mum.
No. Andrew Park writes in, and he says, I've been meaning to write for a while to say thank you for one of the best, if not the best, podcast on writing and authors anywhere. So thank you for that, Andrew. You lads really have a great talent for communicating with authors and being open to what they have to say. Appreciate that. But he says that he listened to the Lauren Bucas episode and he could really
hear...
It
was absolute shit.
yeah, exactly. We ruined that one. He can really hear her despair of the potential impacts of AI on writing. The impacts of ChatGPT and similar so-called AIs on the creative professions could be incalculable. Most of all, he empathises with Lauren's comments about the preferences of the general public. He says, I might disagree with her slightly. It's true that many in the public do not care, but I also think many in the general public care a lot about writing, and perhaps an even larger segment of the public like a good read, but give little thought to what it is about a particular book that made it a good read. However, when those same readers get exposed to bad writing, they recognise it and know they don't like it. So, while the advent of ChatGPT has been almost universally negative, eventually readers and investors will realise that A, it's completely overhyped, B, that it cannot replace a good human writer, and C, that AI overall could kill creativity as we know it. So, yeah, it's a big issue. Thanks for writing in, Andrew. Yeah, and obviously AI has been in the news a lot. There's the big lawsuit now against ChatGPT for books being sucked into ChatGPT and used to train it and things like that. So, I mean, I agree with a lot of what he's saying there in terms of it not. To me, it's a bit like a magician's trick. It looks good, ChatGPT, when you first use it, and
there's no real intelligence.
No, but when you start playing with it a bit more, it starts to be less and less impressive. And with creativity especially, I think it is way off. I mean, it may, of course, we're talking about something that could grow at exponential speed, so it may get better, and it no doubt will. But at the moment, I don't think it's anywhere near good enough to write stories that people actually want to read.
I agree, and I agree with a lot of what Andrew says in his letter, and I think he's totally right that people, even if they can't articulate perhaps what it is that they'd like to read, or why authors, and why particular authors reach them and others don't, I think they recognise bad writing. I think everyone fundamentally recognises bad writing because you get bored. You're reading it and you're like, this is boring.
Yeah.
Whether you're calling it bad writing or whatever, or if you're like, if you're not looking forward to reading it again, or you drop off it, that's bad writing. And I think that is what AI is capable of doing at the moment. I do not think it's capable of writing a fantastic book that is on par with something which a good human being writer can put out. So yeah, I think obviously, by the time this episode goes out, I'm sure it's probably advanced.
Yeah, exactly. It's probably a lot better.
I'm actually an AI, Marco.
Exactly, but it is. I think it's very overhyped at the moment, and but I do think it's very important to things like the lawsuit that authors are taking. I think steps need to be taken to try and stop
Oh yeah,
it
and the Hollywood
progressing
strike, etc. It's exactly, yeah,
and threatening the creative industries, which it definitely does. And arguably it's threatening artists more than it is writers at the moment, because that has grown exponentially, its abilities in that field. So I suppose it's a demonstration of what could happen in the writing world as well.
Yeah, and with the writing world, I suppose it's what it is good enough for at the moment is that kind of sloppy, badly written first draft, which then someone can come in and fix for a cheaper rate, etc. But yeah, I think the whole AI issue is really important, not for now when it's not really on par for books anyway, but in 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years time, who knows? So yeah, putting those safeguards in early doors is really important, I think.
Yeah, so thanks very much, Andrew, for writing in. It is a big topic, so it's one that we're bound to come back to.
Oh yeah, for sure.
A lot in the future. So if you want to write in as well, Tarek will give you the details of how to do that in a moment. But first, we just want to tell you about next week's guest.
Yeah, next week we're sticking with the comedian angle, and we're chatting with Ian Moore, who is a stand-up comic. So that was how he started off his writing career. And
actually also Caimh's friend, as we found out.
That's right, he is indeed, yeah. And he's a very funny guy, and he's written a number of books now, comedy memoirs, but also some serious thrillers. It's a really fun chat we have with him. And if you enjoyed the Caimh one, I think you'll enjoy Ian's chat as well.
Yeah, definitely. So please do tune in for that one. If you enjoyed this episode, please do take the time to give us a rating and review on your favourite podcast app, as that helps us to continue to get great guests on the podcast.
And if you want to get in touch with us like Andrew did, imagine, how do we know Andrew actually exists? Andrew, if you exist, send another email, because I'm now concerned that Andrew's actually an AI writing in saying, guys, don't stress about AI. AI is fine. It's totally cool.
He did give us it came from an email address, but I suppose that could be ChatGPT.
Oh, okay, interesting. And I've changed my view on Andrew 100%. Anyway, if you like, get in touch with us like AI Andrew Bot did, you can send us an email to podcast@writegear.co.uk, or you can get in touch with us across every social media platform there is, essentially, by searching for @page1pod. Or if you'd like to find us on Mastodon, you can do so by going to writing.exchange/@page1pod.
Yep. But otherwise, have a great week, and we'll speak to you again next episode.
See you later.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well, so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is @UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.